And that's basically. Can't argue. Yeah, although they may try to tell me like, that's not the only way to see it, and I'm like, it's the most important way to see it. How have you been?
Everywhere. Friday, we were in Smithville volunteering for LCRA Steps Forward Day.
Don't blame me.
She's good.
You still live in school?
Oh, yeah. Is there anybody on that?
No, I am recording because a couple of people said I'm
Okay.
interested, but I can't be here.
Okay.
So I am recording it for the presentation. And then we'll do that. Madam Vice Chair, since our chair is going to be here today,
Yeah.
the floor is yours. Would you like me to take notes?
Oh, well, I was gonna take some, I can take them. Yeah, Jen asked me to take minutes, so.
Well, yes, minutes, yes, but I also take notes.
Okay,
And so I can send those to you.
awesome. Thank you, Casey.
The floor is yours.
Okay, well, I guess we will call this meeting to order at 11:31 a.m. or 10:31 a.m. Sorry. So we have a guest here. I think she popped out to her car.
She's popped out.
Okay.
She will.
Do you have anything else on the agenda, Casey, that we need to discuss? I know I saw the graphics
You saw
for the
graph-
candidates.
Okay, yes, I sent those to y'all.
Yep.
Y'all are free to share those with candidates. They're also on our text, our real. I have to get the website right. TexasRealtorsSupport.com.
Okay,
TexasRealtorsSupport.com. Our supported local candidates are on that website as well. So you go, if any member of the public were to log in, they can see who we're supporting at the local and state levels.
okay,
Not going on state right now,
Yeah.
but that's not. If you log in, because you are a member and you can log in, you'll also see anything going on the federal. Again, you can't support federal, but because of federal laws, we can only do that to our members.
okay,
So,
got it.
yeah, that's interesting. I did give Jennifer checks for
Okay,
those two candidates. When we were at our meeting last week.
okay.
I never knew anything about that meeting last week. Was I supposed to? Or was
The
it
legislative
only for
update?
realtors?
Well, it went through Four Rivers, and yes, I should have probably sent, because I sent it out, but I just automatically sent it to my real estate agent. So
I
yeah,
don't
that's
know
my
which
bad.
way
I
it
should have
came
sent
from.
that too.
I
It
thought
was
from this committee. No,
It was. And Four Rivers sent it to, did y'all send it to affiliates too?
We put it in the Monday memo.
Okay,
and we sent
yeah, I saw it in the Monday memo. Do you get the Four Rivers emails? Because you're an affiliate, right?
I don't ever see a Monday memo.
There was an email, like they even sent one out this morning.
When
Every
was
Monday
theirs?
they send out an email.
You got one this morning?
Yes.
Yeah, because it had the update.
Last. It's fine, we can.
Yeah. So, all right, well, if there's nothing else about that, Casey, we will move on and have our guest.
Yes.
Sorry, there's so few of us here right now.
That's okay.
But we are recording this to share it with the rest of the members, but we're very excited to have you here.
So, like I said, my name's Rachel Patterson. I am a wildlife biologist with Texas Parks and Wildlife. I cover Bastrop and Caldwell County specifically. And today I'm just gonna be talking about the wildlife tax valuation and, how it can benefit landowners as well as our native Texas wildlife. Okay, so.
And we're interested in this as realtors because a lot of our clients come to us and say, hey, I want to be able to do something with either an ag valuation or a wildlife valuation. We have to explain that process to them as well. It's kind of not walking through it, but who do we go contact and what is feasible? And if we're able to tell them oh, yeah, that thing that you're looking to do where you don't have the set space, you don't have the, like, here's some options, it just brings some more money.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Gotcha. All right, so. Clicking.
It's off, yeah.
Oh, I thought I just turned it on.
It's turned on. Sorry.
Technology is not always our friend.
That's-
Yay.
Hey,
All right,
I had to get you on the right screen.
all right. So first of all, what is a wildlife tax exemption? So it is not an exemption, which is kind of a misnomer that we hear people say all the time. You're not being exempt from taxes, you're just paying it at a different valuation, which is based on the land's production value instead of like the real estate market value. So this is a revenue neutral program in that once you're on an agricultural valuation, you can switch over to wildlife and you'll still be paying the same tax rate. So the primary focus of the land in this program is managing for native wildlife. So you can still have some agricultural operations such as like running cattle, cutting hay, growing crops, that kind of thing, as long as it is secondary to the wildlife management. So it can't like interfere with or overshadow the wildlife. For this program, there's no minimum acreage requirement unless the property has been reduced in size since the previous tax year. So for example, if they split up a property into multiple different tracts, then usually a size requirement kicks in, which tends to vary by county. But the year after that, it goes back to not having that minimum acreage. So traditionally up to 1995, we had only the agricultural appraisal. So this was used for livestock, hay, and crop production. In 1995, the Texas legislature introduced Proposition 11 in order to amend the Texas Constitution, which basically allows us to manage for wildlife under the open space appraisal. This was passed by Texas voters with 62% approval.
Texas Realtors was a big support of this one.
Nice.
Yeah, bravo, you guys. So yeah, this is part of the Constitution now, so this is not going away anytime soon. It would take a lot of legislative effort to do that, so. And then in 2001, Texas Parks and Wildlife worked to develop rules for the land and kind of develop those guidelines for wildlife management. Just depending on like what habitat you have, what sort of species you're managing for. And then the Texas Comptroller adopted those guidelines. So this just kind of shows the different ecoregions of Texas, just kind of based on what county you're in. So depending on which county, oh, laser doesn't work on the TV. So, but you can see like right now we're in Caldwell, which is kind of that light brown. So that's gonna be the Post Oak Savannah ecoregion. But if you're in like Hayes or Comal County, it's gonna be that light purple, so it's the Eastern Edwards Plateau. So the guidelines for management is gonna vary based on what ecoregion you're located in. Because
So what would be the variations, like how big of a variation is it?
it kind of depends, like, so there's different habitat types. So it kind of depends on like sort of what wildlife you're gonna see there, what kind of vegetation you're dealing with. And so like the requirements for those species as far as like how much forage they need, like how much good habitat is gonna vary. Just because you have a lot of variation in like vegetation, the rainfall annually, so.
Okay.
I can kind of pull up those guidelines later for y'all to look at,
Walking in.
so.
Would you talk a little bit about this? I see
Yes.
wildlife
Oh,
use
yeah.
requirement
There's
ranges
those
and
minimum requirements. So like I was saying a little bit before, there's not a minimum acreage unless like the property is split up. So that's when that kind of kicks in. So you can see for like Post Oak Savannah, the minimum is 12.5 acres and the maximum is 16.7 acres. So it's up to the county appraisal district to choose anywhere within that minimum to maximum range, how many acres of land they're gonna require for wildlife tax valuation. So like, say a 20-acre property gets split up into two 10-acre tracts, then those aren't gonna qualify because they don't fall within that range. If that kind of makes sense. So usually what they would require is for them to just stay on ag for another year. And then the following year, that minimum acreage requirement goes away, so then they can just apply for wildlife.
So you had a piece that was at 20
Yes,
and it qualified and was in ag. And you split them into two 10s.
Mhm.
They don't lose that ag.
No,
They keep them even though there's still some
Yes.
chance. You just can't immediately roll into,
correct,
and then the next year, it doesn't matter, you're good to go.
yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah, it's a little confusing.
It was, you were saying that a little bit earlier and I got a little confused and I was gonna ask you about later, that just completely.
How
Yeah.
many years can you leave it at the 210s before you roll into wildlife?
So that minimum acreage requirement, it kicks in like the first year after a property is split up
Okay,
into like smaller acre tracts.
so they only have a year to apply for wildlife.
Well, you have a year in which that minimum acreage requirement is there, but after that year, that requirement goes away. So then you're free to apply for wildlife, even if you didn't meet that acreage requirement the year before.
So if you're outside, either below or above that minimum or max.
Well,
you
if you're
can't
below
do
the
it.
minimum,
Okay, you can't do it for the next, you can't do it for that first year and then but you can after that.
I guess I'm not understanding, if you have 20 acres and it's ag exemption valuation. And you subdivide it, split it up into two lots, what if those people choose to keep it under ag and share cattle grazing? They can do that?
yeah, because the valuation stays with the property,
Okay,
not the owners.
What if one of the 10-acre owners chooses not to have the cattle on their property? Then how soon would they lose their valuation?
It would probably be within like the following tax year. So they could either transition to some other form of agricultural management, like doing like beekeeping or growing crops for wildlife, but they would need to be doing something in order to keep that valuation. So. Okay, so qualifications in order to get this valuation, the property must have a current ag appraisal. So that includes livestock, hay production, farming, beekeeping, timber harvesting. So the way you get that is you have to be doing some sort of agricultural management for at least 5 out of the preceding 7 years in order to qualify for agriculture. So that requirement is just to kind of make sure that people are actually like committed to doing this. And that they're not just like throwing cows on one year and they're like, okay, I'm good.
Yeah.
So once you get the ag appraisal, then you can switch over to wildlife. So, the wildlife, they must be actively managed for human use, so that can include food, recreation, aesthetic value, just as long as the wildlife is being appreciated in some way. And then the landowners must submit a wildlife management plan. And so that plan is going to get filled out according to the guidelines that Texas Parks and Wildlife set forth for whichever ecoregion the property falls under. So, some kind of like pros and cons of wildlife versus agriculture. It's the same tax rate, but you have a little bit more flexibility in management. And that there's just a lot more different management practices you can do.
With wildlife?
Yes. So if you prefer to manage for wildlife instead of running cattle, like I've gotten a lot of people who switch over because they've been running cattle all their life and they just can't keep up with it anymore. Like this is a great option for them. It's also much more sustainable for the land in general, because like, say you are running cattle as part of your habitat management. You would only be stocking them up to what the land can sustain as far as grazing goes. Whereas on agricultural valuation, you're stocking according to what the production value would be. So a lot of times they're requiring you to stock at much higher rates. And so that can sometimes lead to overgrazing. And a lot of times people are having to supplement the cows with hay just to kind of provide enough forage for them. Whereas with the wildlife, you're much more flexible in terms of like how many cattle you stock, what sort of grazing regime you have, how long you keep them on the land throughout the year, that kind of thing.
Do these allow for, because I know sometimes people like lease their land?
Yes.
To allow people, like my dad does, well, he doesn't lease, he's one of the ones that like pays to have his cattle on someone else's land.
Yeah, that can absolutely be incorporated
Okay.
in this. And so it benefits native wildlife by maintaining and restoring their habitat. And if you start on wildlife and you find that it's not really for you, you can always switch back to ag at any time because it's the same tax rate. So the way the program works is there's 7 different categories of management practices. So that's habitat, erosion, and predator control, as well as supplemental water, food, and shelter. And then census, which is basically you're doing some sort of surveys or monitoring of the wildlife on your property. It can also include like monitoring like the vegetation on your property, how that changes from year to year. So the requirement is that you do at least 3 out of the 7 categories each year in order to qualify. So I'm gonna kind of briefly go through each of the different categories. I'm not gonna cover every single practice just because that would take way too long. But I'm gonna try and hit the most common ones that I see. So for habitat control, that includes a number of different practices such as grazing, prescribed burning, range enhancement, brush management, riparian wetland area management, habitat protection for species of concern. That in particular would be if you have like an endangered species located in the area. So this isn't going to apply to everybody. And then prescribed control of native and exotic and feral species can include both like invasive plants as well as invasive wildlife, such as like feral hogs.
Riparian.
Yes, riparian basically means the area surrounding like a river or a creek. So in that areas, you tend to have much more like moist soil types like clays, loams. You tend to have much higher vegetative productivity just because there's more water sources available.
Second time in 2 days I've seen that term and I didn't know what that.
Yeah, so we'll go into that. Okay, so grazing management, this can complement most wildlife programs as long as you're doing it at a more conservative stocking rate. So usually we look at doing some sort of rotational grazing system. So that way, each pasture has time to kind of rest and regrow in between. You can also do high intensity, short duration grazing systems in which you throw on a whole bunch of cattle all at once, but they're only there for a couple of days to like a few weeks out of the year. And then you leave the rest of the year for the vegetation to kind of grow back up and recover. And so this is a good practice for kind of removing like old thatch, as well as kind of stimulating new growth of grasses and wildflowers. Prescribed fire promotes plant diversity and is the most cost-effective method per acre for range and habitat improvement. So this is another thing that really improves the growth of grasses and forbs, Cause it helps to burn off a lot of that old growth. It returns a lot of nutrients to the soil and can help limit the growth of like woody plants, so like mesquite, weesat, shield pond, that kind of thing. So it helps us kind of maintain more of like open grassland habitats. So this is usually conducted under a burn plan that should be written or approved by a professional. So if somebody just kind of throws a match out on the property, like that doesn't count. They gotta have an actual plan with like the weather conditions
Okay,
outlined.
do
all
y'all
their
have a certain, do
resources.
y'all avoid doing it like during the summer or?
Typically, yes, because we're pretty much always under a burn ban.
Right.
During the summer. So people will do it more in like late fall or like winter, early spring. So just depending on whether they're trying to promote like more grasses or more wildflowers. That time area kind of.
Right now, everything's under a red flag, so with the wind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do the volunteer fire departments work with you on that, prescribed burn schedules? Are they there to help in case it gets out of control?
So we will definitely let them know beforehand to say like, hey, we're doing a burn at this property. This is the resources we're working with. So that way, like, if something gets out of hand, like they're already like ready to go.
Yeah.
People can either like work with Texas Parks and Wildlife, like we have a program to where we help people kind of conduct their first prescribed burn, just to kind of like show them the ropes. There's different prescribed burn associations, which are groups of local landowners who have all like undergone like prescribed fire training. And they can kind of help each other out with burning on their properties. And then there's professional burn contractors that you can hire as well. So it just kind of depends on what route somebody takes.
Do you have a list of those?
I can
Parks.
email you a list, if that works. So, brush management, this includes the control of invasive woody plants. So, when I say invasive, it doesn't only mean exotic plants, meaning ones that originated outside of Texas and have now kind of like proliferated everywhere. It can also include native plants that have a tendency to kind of like overgrow and kind of like spread rapidly over the rest of the habitat. So like Yukon holly, mesquite, cedar are things that we either didn't see in this part of the state historically, or they weren't as widespread. So brush management usually includes like either removing them or just kind of like controlling their growth. So this can include both like mechanical use, so anything from like a pair of tree loppers to a dozer will work, just depending on like the size of the area that you're taking care of. It can include the use of herbicide as well. But this is a good practice to help increase plant diversity, because what we see with a lot of these species is they tend to overgrow and kind of like close in the tree canopy. So that way there's not a lot of sunlight that's kind of reaching the forest floor. So by kind of thinning out these species or removing them entirely, you get a lot more stimulation for like grasses and wildflowers, which helps provide a lot more forage for wildlife. So range enhancement is basically when you were doing some sort of reseeding project in order to improve the diversity of native species. So this can include introducing some sort of soil disturbance in order to stimulate new growth, such as mowing, disking, fire, or grazing. This can include hay cutting as well. So preferably you're not going to cut more than a third of a given area annually, just so that way you always have like some tall vegetative cover that animals can use, particularly like your ground nesting birds, your deer. The fawns will need cover whenever they're really young. It'll also help provide forage for wildlife and flowers for pollinators as well. So you would only be doing like a specific area from each year. But this can also include the conversion of tame pastures over to native grasslands. So if you're like trying to remove, say like a pasture full of Bermuda grass and reintroduce natives, like that would fall under this practice. So riparian area and wetland management. So this is basically gonna be like your creeks and your rivers, wetlands, ponds, that kind of thing. A lot of these areas are really sensitive to like runoff and pollution as well as erosion. So, putting up fencing to either exclude livestock at all times or just limit them to like certain areas that they can access. That'll help reduce the amount of soil erosion from trampling as well as just water pollution. You can also do either like partial or complete deferment of grazing, meaning you'll just like not allow them to graze in these areas in order to kind of maintain this habitat. You can also establish vegetation, so if you have like some really eroded stream banks, reseeding them with native plants that have good root structures can really help to hold that soil together. And it's also good for like filtering nutrients and runoff as well. And then another option would be just providing alternative water sources for livestock, such as like water troughs, cattle tanks, just so that way they're not using these areas as much. And so erosion control is gonna be the second major category. So this can include anything from pond construction and repair to gully shaping, which you can see in the photo, that's a pretty large one to have to tackle. But basically, if you have a gully, just kind of like regrading the soil to kind of smooth it all out and fill it in. Planting native plants along like your stream sides and wetlands. Like I just said, like they're really good for anchoring the soil and kind of reducing that erosion. Dike and levee construction and management, which we don't really see in this area because we don't really have large wetland systems. And then water diversion is basically when you install some sort of water structures to kind of like divert the water to like a pond or a creek. So that way it's not just running through your pastures.
You have pond construction on there.
Yes.
And I know in the past, Texas A&M, I know they used to do this, was, if you had this property, you wanted to put a pond on it, you could contact them and they would come out and help design a pond, you know, for your area that had the bell shape, was in the right location, right materials, if they still do that.
I don't know if AgriLife still does that specifically. I know the Natural Resources Conservation Service will help out with that.
Okay.
They work primarily with like soil and water conservation, so that's like one of their areas of specialty. There's also different like pond and lake management companies that you can hire to help design the pond, and then they'll actually construct it for you.
Yes.
So it just kind of depends on what route you want to take. So here's just a couple of examples of erosion projects. So on the top left, they kind of constructed a dam along that pond just to kind of hold the water and keep it from spreading over the pasture and eroding the soils. You can have revegetation, in which you're just replanting those native grasses to help anchor the soil. Rock berms and check dams help to kind of like break up the water flow. So whenever you have like stream flow across like a pasture, it tends to be like really narrow and concentrated. So installing structures like that, it kind of helps to disperse the water when it hits those structures, and it like spreads out that water flow more. So it's not going to erode the soil as heavily. And then vegetated riprap is basically you're stabilizing stream banks by like placing some sort of rocks or other materials to kind of like anchor it together, and then reseeding with those grasses that'll eventually like come up in between the rocks and kind of hold it all together. So predator control, this can include both native and invasive species. So feral hogs is obviously a big one. This can also include fire ants. They're a big issue to a lot of our native wildlife species. Brown-headed cowbirds. You tend to see those a lot in like pastures, particularly if you have cattle. Those are a native species, but they're what we call nest parasites. And that they'll go out and lay their eggs in the nests of other birds to kind of like force them to raise their young for them. So.
Sounds like assholes.
So, but yeah, it's
That is very bad.
yeah, so it's detrimental to the other birds species because they're having to use all this energy to raise their young. So trapping can be one method to kind of help control their population.
Heard of those,
Jerks.
European starlings and house sparrows are both non-native species. They were both introduced from Europe. So, and they can kind of like take over habitats from native songbird species. And then your native predators, which can include anything from like raccoons, skunks, coyotes, bobcats. Managing for them can be a practice as well. For them, we kind of have the caveat that they should be thoughtfully managed as part of like an overall habitat management plan. Because if you're just going out and you're trapping like every single coyote you see, but you're not doing anything to provide good habitat, so that way your prey species have cover from those coyotes, then it's just kind of like a short-term solution, not really a long-term one. So native predator control should be part of like your overall plan and not just like,
The plan.
yeah, it shouldn't be your only solution,
Right.
basically.
I mean, I'm sure nobody in Texas is trying to make that their only solution.
Yeah. All right, so supplemental water, this can include marsh and wetland restoration, as well as putting out some sort of water structures, such as like using wells, water troughs, windmill overflow. There's also different like structures that you can build, which I'll show you on the next slide. And then spring development or enhancement, if you have any natural springs on your property, just kind of maintaining those and keeping the water quality good can count. So here's just a couple of examples of the different structures that can create for water. So that can include like putting like in-ground troughs, anything from like rubber tubs to having some sort of rain catchment system. So the idea behind this is you are basically providing extra water for wildlife that's not already available on the property. So if somebody already has like a large pond or like a creek that stays wet year round, like this probably wouldn't be as big of a priority for them, but for properties in which they don't already have those water sources, like these are a great way to help provide water to your native wildlife. All right, supplemental food can include grazing management, prescribed burning, range reseeding, which is all stuff I've kind of talked about before with habitat management. Some of these practices can overlap between different categories, but once you do one of them, like say I do grazing management, I can count it as either a habitat practice or a supplemental food practice. I can't count it for both on the same plan. So for this one, we're going to be looking at food plot feeders and then just kind of like managing fields and croplands. So the idea behind supplemental food is that you are either managing habitat to increase the quantity and quality of foods that is naturally produced for wildlife, or you can provide artificial food such as like feeders and food plots. But We want to focus mainly on like the habitat management side of things. Like, while you can do feeders and food plots, those should stay as a supplemental food source. Like, that shouldn't become like the only food source that wildlife are using, if that makes sense. So a lot of times what we'll look at doing is like strip mowing or disking, or just overseeding pastures, or converting non-native pastures to native grasslands, just to increase the amount of native forage that we're producing. Supplemental shelter can include a variety of different practices. So a lot of times you'll see like bird boxes as well as bat boxes. Those are great for areas in which those species, they typically nest in like hollow cavities in trees. So if you don't have a lot of that already available on your property, doing the nest boxes is a good way to provide extra shelter sources. Brush piles and slash retention is basically just constructing brush piles. That's really good for like small mammals as well as like ground nesting birds, to provide cover in habitats where you don't normally have a lot of brush cover, such as like open pastures. Fence line management, the idea behind that is basically you're allowing trees and brush to grow along a certain length of the fence line, so that way animals have some cover as they're traveling along the fence lines. Because a lot of animals kind of use them as like travel corridors. So by having that brush there, it helps provide some cover against both ground predators as well as like birds of prey. Hay meadow, pasture, and cropland management. So the way that that can be a supplemental shelter practice is kind of like the hay cutting that I talked about earlier. If you don't cut more than like a third of a given field each year, you're always going to be leaving some vegetative cover for wildlife. So, and that can include like not cutting it during like the fawning and nesting seasons. Like, that can help this count as a shelter practice. Half cutting trees and shrubs. So if you look at the top right photo, that's basically where you kind of like cut through branches halfway, so that way they kind of lean over and touch the ground. That's really good for like small mammals as well as like quail and like turkey poults, because it helps provide some cover from aerial predators. Another thing that you can do is, if you have a lot of trees on your property, leaving the dead trees standing helps provide cover, because it's going to be a lot easier for animals to kind of like burrow out cavities for them to nest in. A lot of our native like pollinating bee species will nest in like hollow trees and logs, so that's really beneficial to them. Another thing you can do is basically girdling the trunk of a tree. So like, if this is my tree, if I kind of cut in like an inch around the trunk of the tree, that'll kill it, but still leave it standing. So that way you can provide cover for these animals. But yeah, these are just kind of a couple of examples of that. And then lastly is the census category. So this is basically, you're doing some sort of survey to monitor the wildlife population on your property. So there's a number of different practices that can be done, such as like spotlight counts, where you're driving around the property at night with spotlights and basically just counting how many animals you see. Stand counts is when you're recording observations from like a deer blind. Daylight incidental observations is when you're just keeping a log of everything you see as you're just kind of going about your business on the property. Harvest data collection. So if somebody hunts on their property, particularly if they're interested in managing for game species, this is a really good way of kind of like tracking trends in populations from year to year. So if you record like male or female, adult or juvenile. For bucks, if you record like the antler characteristics, you can kind of compare those results from year to year to kind of see which way the population is trending. Like, do you have a more balanced sex ratio? Are there more females than males? Is juvenile birth really low this year? That's kind of the sort of info that can tell you. Nest box monitoring. This is something I always recommend to people if they're putting nest boxes up. So during the nesting season, if they just check on it periodically and just record what they see, so like what species is in there, how many eggs they see, how many youngs get hatched out, that can help you kind of measure the success of those nest boxes. Point counts are great for songbirds. Basically, you would kind of like designate a couple of like random points across your property. And at each of those points, you just stand there for 5 minutes and you just mark down what species you see or you hear calling. And you can compare that seasonally and from year to year, just to kind of monitor like what species are using the property, what their population kind of looks like, and that can kind of help inform you whether you need to provide more resources for them.
I've done the Merlin ID app.
Yeah, that one's great.
It makes it really easy to determine what's on your property.
Yeah. Vegetation inventory is really good if you're doing a project like brush management or like range reseeding. So basically, it's when you would try to identify the different plant species you have on the property, kind of like before and after a project. So that can kind of help you determine like the success of those projects, as well as if you need to do like any sort of follow-up work. And then endangered species monitoring, obviously that's only going to apply if you have an endangered species. But if somebody is like doing research on the property, say like they've got like trail cameras up, or if they've got like some sort of acoustic recording equipment, say if they're monitoring for like bats or certain bird species, you can ask that researcher for like copies of that data, and then that can go towards your survey practice. So when you're determining your management practices, like first you want to figure out what wildlife species you're interested in. So any native Texas species will count. So this can be anything from like deer to songbirds to bats to pollinators to turtles, just whatever is naturally occurring on the property. And then you want to determine what the limited resources are on your property. So say if I'm managing for turkeys, during the nesting season, they'll use a lot of like tall grass cover in order to build their nests in. So if I have a pasture with like really short grass, then I can be like, hey, maybe introducing some native grass species would be one of my projects. Or like maybe I should put out a turkey feeder to kind of entice them into using the property. So the food, water, and shelter requirements are going to be different for each species. So you definitely want to kind of look that up beforehand and then just kind of see like, okay, what do I already have on the property that works for them, and what can I do to help provide better resources? And then you want to determine kind of like when in the year, how often, or to what degree you will implement your practices. So a lot of these practices are going to have like minimum requirements as far as like the acreage that it should affect each year, that kind of thing. So if you go on to our website, it's going to have a lot of the guidelines for wildlife tax valuation. So basically you would look up what ecoregion you are according to the map, and then click on one of those links and it will basically give you guidelines for all of the different management categories. And it'll kind of like go into depth for each of the practices and tell you what the minimum requirements are. So like, for example, if I'm doing brush management on my property, the minimum requirement for that is you do at least 10 acres of the total brushy area or 10% of it, whichever one is smaller. So if you go on that website, it's gonna have all that outlined for you. So some updates to the wildlife tax valuation. I did look into if there's any sort of legislation coming out.
Question.
Yeah. There's some coming out for the agricultural appraisal. From what I kind of skimmed through it, it's basically just saying that like, if somebody is like not a US citizen, or if they're operating as part of a business from another country that doesn't have like certain qualifications, like they can't qualify for ag. I didn't see anything for wildlife specifically, but one thing that Texas Parks and Wildlife is currently doing is we're going to be updating a lot of the management guidelines, as well as like our management plan form, just because a lot of that hasn't been updated since like 2011. So some of it is really out of date. We're also looking to get more credit for like large habitat projects. So if you do an erosion control practice or like a supplemental water practice, a lot of those will get you like credit for the next 10 years because they're very like cost and labor intensive. But restoration projects like the brush removal or doing like range reseeding, like a lot of times you'll be doing a lot of that work within like a year or two, but then you only get like that year's worth of credit, even though a whole ton of work and money goes into that. So we're currently working to propose like a 5-year credit for those projects. So once you do that project, you get credit for the next 5 years.
How do you, like, you get the credit for 5 years, or you mentioned the other one for 10 years, what do you do in that 10 years, is that to get more credit?
So like say I do a project where I am reconstructing my pond because I have erosion issues. Once I do that project, it'll count towards my wildlife valuation for the next 10 years. So as long as I'm keeping up with it, like maintaining it as needed, I can claim that as a practice without having to do a whole nother project in order to claim erosion control as one of my practices. So we're looking to do that basically with the habitat stuff as well. So, and then another thing we're looking to add is CWD testing of deer as a census practice. Just because there is like a lot of data that comes out of that, so we're looking to add that as an applicable practice as well. But yeah, if you guys have any questions, I cover Caldwell County, so landowners out of there, they're welcome to contact me. Those are the other biologists for Comal and Guadalupe counties, as well as Gonzales and Hayes, because we all kind of cover different areas.
But you said your Bastrop too as well.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we all tend to cover anywhere from like 1 to 3 counties, just depending on like population size and like how much like rural land there is, that kind of thing, so. But yeah, any questions?
Somebody wanting to do a reseed project,
Yes.
where is a good place for them to get that bulk seed?
So there's a couple of different distributors that you can get seed from. So like Bammert, Turner Seed Co., Native American Seed. I can send you guys a whole list. We do have like reseeding programs available for landowners. So one program that Texas Parks and Wildlife does, it's called Pastures for Upland Birds. Basically, the way it works is there's no money being changed hands, but we will provide them with all of the herbicide and like a custom-made seed mix according to the soils on their property. So if somebody has like a big pasture full of like Bermuda or King Ranch bluestem, they can use the herbicide to kind of wipe that stuff out first, and then they'll reseed with that seed mix. We also have a seed drill as well that they can borrow, just to hook up to a tractor that helps do all the seeding for them. So for our program, we typically look at project sizes of 25 acres or more. Though we can kind of go as low as like 20 acres, just depending on the project. But the Native Prairies Association of Texas has a similar program that kind of targets those projects that are less than 25 acres. And for that one, they'll basically do like a 50% cost share with the landowners. So they'll pay for up to half of the total cost of the project. And then they'll kind of collaborate with us in order to come up with like the seed mix for the property. So, but yeah.
And you come and talk to groups like us and bigger. What is the most exciting thing you like to share? Talk about? What do you get most excited?
What keeps you doing this every?
Yeah.
Well, obviously I like being outdoors, otherwise I wouldn't have chosen this job field.
Right.
But I really like getting to work with landowners who are really excited about the wildlife on their property. Like occasionally I work with people to where they're just in it for the tax break and it's like, okay, just do this, this and this, and whatever.
They're just checking the box, basically.
Yes,
Yeah.
but like the people who are actually passionate about it, they're like, oh, I really want to reintroduce like turkeys on this property, or like I really want to help out like our native pollinator species. Like working with them is really cool because then I can really get them into like these habitat restoration projects. And so we can actually do a lot of good work in restoring habitat for wildlife. Because so much of Texas is privately owned land, we kind of have to meet people where they're at in order to kind of like manage that land for wildlife. So getting to work with the people who are like just super into that is really great.
That makes sense.
Oh, I once heard about the ranch towards Fredericksburg that the guy restored to its natural habitat. And all springs popped up that hadn't been visible. I don't know how he did it, but he got a historic restoration award and placement on it.
Out in Fredericksburg, you said?
Yeah, near that area. It's a huge ranch with lots of acreage. But I just would have loved to see more springs pop up on my property.
Yeah.
And seed, you can go to 5D feed and farm here, and you can buy bags of seed all day long of different kinds. They'll order it if they don't have it. So you want to stop, check with your farm and ranch feed stores.
Oh,
They also have that spreader you can rent, or they give to you for free if you buy the seed from them. So
Like those handheld one?
no, it's one that hooks up the back of your tractor or your truck.
Oh, it gives you
Right.
for free?
Yeah, it's those great
they
big huge
loan
boxes.
it to you,
They
right?
loan it to you.
Oh.
Yeah,
That's
from,
right.
from there to here, and really tall, and it's got a clutch handle on
what
it,
you're
but
talking about.
I'm not strong enough, I tried it with my leg. Going out there, and so I can't do it unless I have some man ready to come open it up and set it on the distribution level, but anyway.
So we see, I see this, I get this question a lot, we see this, beekeeping. It's
Yes.
kind of what we see a lot, correct me if this is wrong, is kind of a low threshold to entry. Because it requires, I think, the least amount of land requirements, but then people find out that it takes a lot to actually do it. So they get a little discouraged, is that?
Yeah, so it definitely doesn't require as much land as say like cattle and like hay and that kind of thing. But each county still has their own requirement as far as like how many boxes that you have to have in order to qualify for it. So you can't just like put up one B box and be like, okay, I'm good. Like normally they require anything from like 5 to 10 at least. And so if you have somebody that you can basically like hire out to do the beekeeping for you, to where you're basically just providing a place for them to do it, like that can be a good way to get into it. But it definitely does require a lot more work than people think it does starting out.
I've always heard one of the easiest ones is counting birds, like bluebird houses on your property and. Can you single out a species like just bluebirds and count them?
Yeah, so, bluebirds we tend to see mostly in like really open space habitat, such as like fields, pastures, meadows. So for people who have that kind of habitat, I normally recommend that they put up nest boxes. Because bluebirds are a cavity nesting species and that they need sort of that structure. And a lot of times we're kind of lacking trees that provide that naturally in those types of habitats. So that's a really good practice for them. And so, like I was saying earlier, doing like some sort of survey of the nest boxes is really good to kind of help you measure like the success of those boxes and like whether or not like maybe you need to move them to a different area on the property, that kind of thing. So one thing I will clarify with the beekeeping. So that species is the European honeybee that they use for beekeeping. So that qualifies under the agricultural valuation. It does not qualify under wildlife because it's not a native bee species.
Okay.
Right, and sorry, and let me clarify where I was going with that, people see that as their entry into the agricultural
Yes.
valuation, so that they can then down the road transition
Yeah.
into the wildlife.
Yeah, and that can absolutely be an option. Particularly for like your smaller acreages, it is gonna require a little bit more work than most people usually anticipate.
Yeah, like the 60-acre tract that Austin Realtor came over and chopped it up into 10 acres until they were ready, they could get ag exemption. And they couldn't, so a lot of them flipped the property and some of them threw up beehives to get ag, what is it?
Valuation.
Or
Well,
they
they
get
get ag first.
Yeah.
Ag valuation.
Or the ag first.
So they got it with beekeeping with 10 acres where otherwise it wouldn't have qualified.
Yeah,
Crazy.
Questions?
Well, my question was more for the group, but including Rachel, is this something that we think we could do on a larger scale? Kind of like the legislative update, but I was thinking more like breakfast, but opening it up to our larger realtor membership.
Think it would be good.
Yeah, and trying to do like, have you come back and maybe do like a breakfast meet either at 9 or 10 in the morning one day and open it up.
I think it'd be really, I mean, I'm not a realtor, but this is one of the
I
farmers.
think anything that deals with farm and
Would
ranch.
love it.
We're
Yeah.
gonna turn around and talk to people we run into every single day. about
Right.
this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're gonna have people ask us questions. That's the point.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I went to the cattlemen's meeting last Tuesday. Independent cattlemen's meets quarterly here. And they brought in a agent from Bastrop County. You may know him. I can't remember his name. I
is it
apologize.
Dakota?
No, that didn't ring a bell. Young, handsome dude, though. Anyway, he talked, he talked about mesquites and Yopon hollies, that it's kind of a misnomer that, he said it's true that they draw all the water out of the ground around them, that they're bad on using up water, but he said that's not what affects our aquifers. It's leaf canopy. You went on to say that like if you've got a wooded area and it's full with undercover brush and the leaf canopy breaks the waterfall to the ground and it's not going in the aquifer. So he was talking about cleaning out your underbrush under all your wooded areas. Like I have woods on my property and then pasture, hay fields and cattle grazing, but I just thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I haven't heard that, but that's a really good point.
Uh-huh. I mean, I removed all the mesquite with the machine with the
Mhm.
fork in my cattle grazing pasture and the hayfield, it's kept it down year after year after cutting it, so. But what I'm seeing more wildlife of lately that I hadn't seen in years, cause I think fire ants killed them, is cottontail rabbits. They're appearing more and more,
Yeah, I've seen them quite a bit
you
recently.
know.
I feel like it's a vicious cycle with the ants. Like
Yeah.
one year there's ants and then the next year it's something else and then it kind of
Well,
goes
yeah.
back to ants and then.
Mhm.
What the other ants that have taken back over are the ones that I grew up knowing, and I'm 74 years old.
Harvester ants.
I don't know, they're the great big red ones that have a
Yeah.
great big mound,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
clear, and they go for trails everywhere.
Mhm.
They don't seem to bite you or sting you or anything,
Yeah, those are the harvester ants.
they are. Well, is it good to leave those mounds on your property?
Yes. Yeah, so
Cause
those,
the little horny toads used to eat those.
yeah, that was their primary like prey species.
Kill
Once the fire ants moved in,
the
like,
horned toad.
they killed a lot of like the harvester ants and kind of outcompeted with them
Uh-huh.
for resources. So we lost a lot of the harvester ants and then we lost a lot of the horned lizards as a result of that. So, but we are starting to see the harvesters kind of bounce back. So I would definitely recommend like leaving them alone as much as possible.
Yeah,
They're generally
Yeah.
not very aggressive like the fire ants are.
yeah.
And so hopefully if we get enough of them widespread, we might start to see the horned lizards kind of make their way back to this part of Texas. So, but I think that'll still be like years down the road.
Is it true you can work with some government agency to introduce them back to your property?
So we do have like a program that we've done in the past for horned lizard introductions. We tend to do that more in like West and South Texas. So areas where we have like hundreds of acres of like really good horned lizard habitat is where we would focus on reintroducing them. Cause like right now, we don't really have as much of that habitat available to them. Just cause like a lot of it's been converted to like pastures or like other uses. So if we kind of like restore habitat for them, then maybe down the road, we might look at reintroducing them to this part of the state. But doing it right now is kind of a moot point, cause we don't have that habitat available for them.
Well, Rhonda's gonna grow harvester ants on her property.
Yeah. God, look, the mounds have really
You can come
taken
get 'em
over,
from her
they're
place.
huge. They're huge.
No, there's no more questions and there was nothing else on the agenda, correct? All right, well, I will call the meeting to conclusion at 11:34. Thank you,
Thank
Rachel.
you so much.
Yeah, this was very
Rachel
informative.
brought gifts for y'all.
Oh,
including
nice.
her business card.
Oh, cool.
Yeah,
this
I may be
calendar
reaching
is
out
great.
about us trying to schedule like a larger scale.
Okay.
Cause yeah, I was sitting here and was like, oh, like,
All
this is
of
something new for the week,
Yeah,
finding
this is really
knowledge,
cool.
so.
Yeah.
It was
So I know
interesting.
I only just kind of like skimmed the surface of the